Welcome to the Rimworld mod rundown. We'll be taking a quick look at what you can expect to see from Rue's Minotaur Xenotype. For starters, you'll need to own the Biotech DLC, and whilst this mod might scream about it in your mod launcher, it doesn't actually require Harmony to work. A 2-for-1 rundown in this video, as we'll be going over the Minotaur Xenotype and the expanded mod for it too, which adds further optional content if you would like to widen the influence of the Xenotype within your game. So with that in mind, I'll cover everything included in the base mod first, and then we'll go over the additional features added in with the expanded mod afterwards, so hopefully it makes it clear exactly what is coming from where. With the Minotaur Xenotype, you'll be getting that one Xeno with some brand new genes, a whole bunch of additional backstories, 8 new weapons, 1 bit of clothing, 6 body tattoos, 2 abilities, some Xenotype icons so you can flesh out the game with more custom races if you would like, and a sizable chunk of mod options. So let's do the sensible thing and cover the Xenotype itself. Minotaurs are massive. If you have Vanilla Expanded Framework active whilst using this mod, it'll make use of the scaling settings and have Minotaurs appear slightly larger than the other Xenotypes. This is further represented through their Herculean gene, which is doing a lot of work. Whilst Minotaurs aren't necessarily ranged or melee focused, they are going to have a large bonus to their melee damage profile, at the cost of being a much larger target, which makes them considerably easier to hit with ranged weapons and makes dodging essentially impossible for them. Of course, the upside is that they can naturally carry more and even use heavy weapons from Vanilla Expanded thanks to this trait, if you have it installed of course. They're also much more reliable at arresting another colonist without any drama, because who's honestly going to try and stand up to them? If you're running a cannibal colony, you'll like Minotaurs because they pack more delicious meat and leather, making just a few of them go a very long way in keeping you fed after a raid. The downside to being quite so massive is that Minotaurs tend to flatten other Xenotypes in the bedroom, so loving is going to come with a crushed debuff.
You want die like last men visit Amazonia?
What'd they die of?
Crushed pelvises.
Yes!
Oh, thank you, Lord in heaven.
They're also going to want more loving the most during April-May because of their estrus cycle gene, causing them to experience a pretty hefty mood penalty if they aren't either sterile or already pregnant. So break out the Lucozade and make sure you're not having an alcoholic drink before bed. Skill wise, they're going to suffer slightly poor social and intellectual, which aren't crippling downsides as it's only a -4, but they don't actually come with any inherent proficiency either. Those skills aren't the only negative though, with them having an aggressive nature as standard, making that melee damage bonus especially dangerous when they get involved in social fights. Expect to see missing toes, fingers and shattered noses on their opponents frequently. They can use this aggression in a potentially beneficial way too, thanks to Bovine Temper and the ability that it grants. See red. When activated, this is going to cause all nearby pawns to flee in terror, drop the Minotaur into a berserker rage, and provide an intense health effect for a very limited duration, with that ability's 7-hour duration including the come down from the beneficial side of the effect too. Initially it provides a bonus 70% movement, 100% manipulation, 15 melee hit chance, 200% pain shock threshold, and halves incoming stagger and damage, as well as making the character totally immune to being set on fire. The hardest hitting downside to this of course is that you're going to lose all control of the affected colonist, so this has an extremely high likelihood of causing them to charge face first into whatever the nearest threat is, and then just keep ploughing through. Hopefully it's an enemy, because you weren't insane enough to use this near a friendly, were you? This part of the effect will last around an hour before it starts to fade to diminishing. This grants 30% movement and 40% manipulation, so a large portion of the bonuses are immediately gone, with the biggest threat now being that there is no damage reduction providing mitigation for that berserker, that's probably already balls deep inside enemy lines, taking hits from 4 or more directions at a single time. Even worse is that around an hour later, diminishing then becomes exhausted, reducing movement and manipulation by 10%, so now they're lethargically swinging at any remaining attackers before the final stage, Aftermath. This can be seen as fortunate in some ways, as it'll drop the colonists to the floor with a max consciousness of 10%, so they're not going to keep fighting until they die, and you can outlast any hostile Minotaurs using this rage by just staying out of their way for a few hours. The main issue is going to be coming from any consciousness loss effects that work a little bit out of the norm, especially from other modded content, or if in the process of raging they manage to get themselves a nice new brain scar in the midst of combat. The second ability that all Minotaurs have, unless you go changing things in the options anyway, is lactation. By default you can milk both male and female Minotaurs, with the male's milk tasting a little bit saltier. You'll also find the milking spot in the production tab of your architect menu, so you can designate a location for the colonists with the lactation gene to go and relieve themselves automatically. It makes it easy to ensure that fresh produce isn't just being scattered around the base and left to spoil. This leaves us with 2 more functional genes, with the ears, head, horns, voice and skin tones being pure cosmetics. The ungular grade legs provide a small amount of move speed, massively increase the rate that the colonists will generate filth, and increases the melee dodge chance by 10%, which is still going to be more heavily offset by that Herculean gene. These legs can be absolutely fantastic on practically every colonist imaginable, especially if you can offset that cleanliness debuff by using furniture expanded and putting bins around your base. Not only do they provide a useful dodge and move speed bonus, but they also remove thoughts around being naked, so a naked brutality Minotaur has at least one less thing to worry about. Then, lastly for the genes, you have the ruminant stomach. This massively increases the size of the colonist's nutrition bar, as well as granting a large bonus to eating raw food and allowing Minotaurs to eat hay. It's a very niche colony setup, but hay grass can be more beneficial to grow than rice in some cases. It has a longer growing time, but it has a much greater yield, as well as running 0 risk of any food poisoning, with the downside being it's going to offer absolutely no mood bonus. It is a viable option, but is it a good option? Not really, but it's going to work in a pinch. Thematically it fits perfect if you want to do it for the vibe. Now, whilst there are a lot of additional backstories included with Ruse Minotaurs, they are incredibly tedious to cover. Just know that at the time of recording you're getting 23 more adult backstories and 14 for childhood. Minotaurs aren't locked to these backstories from this pool either, so they can still roll other options from base game or modded content. The tattoos that have been included aren't locked to the Minotaur Xenotype either, although some of them may look questionable on other Xenotypes, as they're designed to provide patterns that you would typically see on a cow, making it look like horrific skin conditions in some cases, or you can use it to simulate a really cool vitiligo effect. The new bit of clothing is nice and quick to cover. You're going to unlock a tail coat with complex clothing research. It's a powerful bit of gear for socialites. It costs the same amount of material as a duster, but it needs more work to complete, and whilst they may use the same amount of materials, not all gear is created equally. The duster is going to get more bang for your buck in terms of all 3 armor types and both installations, as well as covering the legs too. So the tailcoat must need to do something crazy to justify using it over the Old Faithful. Well, yes and no. You're going to lose 50% general labour speed.
Nope.
But for that loss you're going to gain a little bit of cleanliness, as well as improved negotiation and social impact. If you have a colonist that is almost entirely dedicated to wardening, this can speed up the process of lowering resistance and build a better relationship very quickly, making it easier to get around the low opinion debuff on a fresh capture. Being real though, the majority of you stopped listening as soon as I said it had a labour debuff. Now the weapons you get with this mod are baller. Only one of them is going to be craftable, and they are all going to be locked behind needing the Herculean trait. Unlike heavy weapons from the Vanilla Weapon Expanded series, you can't wield these by having things like tough or by wearing power armor, so they are exclusively Minotaur weapons unless you get digging into gene modding and start taking samples so you can make all of your colony.
Better, faster, stronger.
Let's start with what you can do to get that ball rolling then. The Epsilon axe comes with the smithing research, so you don't even need to progress into long blades to have a seriously destructive melee weapon for your Minotaurs. It only needs 100 metal, and it packs a whopping 40% armor penetration, with a reduction to melee hit chance of 5 and a small move speed debuff. Enemies are going to see these swings coming from a mile away because it's just such a big and heavy weapon to throw around, but they'll need to dodge it given its damage profile. Whilst its DPS may appear lower compared to things like a spear or a longsword, a normal quality axe will be hitting for 27 damage from the head, with it being able to either use a cutting or blunt attack. So whilst a longsword may do more DPS, it's because it's swinging faster for less, with it only offering sharp damage on its highest attacks. Ideally this weapon is going on a Minotaur with a brawler trait, to offset that awful hit chance penalty, as its extremely long wind up time absolutely kills any effectiveness with it if it misses even a single swing. especially if enemies start throwing dirt in your eyes.
Pocket sand. Yeah.
We'll go over the more elusive weapons now. You're most likely going to find these offered as a quest reward or as complex loot, which in turn means you're normally going to get them at a fairly high quality too. I'll cover them at a normal level for the sake of consistency across the series though. Starting with the melee options, the Labrys is extremely similar to the Epsilon Axe, it's just a much more extreme version. It has an even bigger hit chance reduction and move speed debuff, but it has the upside of offering a much cleaner attack pool, as the weapon either hits with the handle or the head, with that massive double axe blade dealing 45 sharp damage, at 43% penetration on a 4.3 second swing. So this is capable of completely destroying a humanoid-sized target's torso in a single swing. Something to maybe keep in mind if you see an enemy Minotaur using one of these. Even if they don't hit you in something vital like the head or the chest, this can remove an entire limb, with the overflow damage likely taking off something else important too. If you wanted to go a different route and vary it up a little, there's the Damocles. This sword doesn't offer much in the way of damage, with its attacks being lightning fast nicks and cuts, so you are more likely to make someone collapse from exsanguination or overwhelming amounts of pain, rather than outright obliterating them. It has the same issue as an overweight guy with a small penis though, in that it lacks any real penetration, so an opponent even wearing strong leather is going to be able to shrug off a surprising amount of attacks from this weapon. Its occasional critical strike is absolutely devastating though. Don't be fooled by the damage profile linked to it on the information page. This critical will eviscerate a target when it procs. The sword itself isn't entirely combat focused either, as it comes with a bonus to social impact, a tiny hit to movement speed, and worryingly, a massively strong hit to mental break threshold of 55%. So you want to remember who's wielding this. They might be better dropping it between fights to avoid completely snapping if anything goes wrong in the colony. From a light precise sword to a heavy crushing Oxenhammer. This takes what that axe did and goes even further. It offers just one solitary attack type on a 5.3 second swing for 40 damage. Obviously this is hitting for blunt damage as well, so it's much harder to mitigate than a sharp attack, making it more effective against a mech threat or spacer geared opponents. To offset the biblically powerful swing, this lowers melee dodge chance and hit chances, as well as slowing move speed and increasing sleep fall rate by 800%. So you need to keep this thing on a shelf for 99% of the time, as it absolutely cripples whoever's wielding it, forcing them to spend most of the day in bed. Unless of course you can get lucky with a sleepless gene. Just keep the sleep loss in mind throughout an extended fight or a siege too, as you'll find the wielder can collapse mid-combat, if you aren't carrying some emergency coffee or a dose of wake up. The Tumbel is another blunt option you have. It deals less damage more consistently than the Oxenhammer, but it's also got a few tricks up its sleeve too. It isn't anywhere near as damaging to carry, and it only slightly lowers hit chance and move speed, with an even greater amount of armor penetration, and it still hits for blunt damage. This has the unique effect of causing hearing loss on the target if they're struck by the bell end.
Ow, my groin!
No, not like that, the one on the weapon. It causes tinnitus, so if you want to damage the hearing of any potential prisoners, go ahead. I'm also not sure if it's intended behaviour or not, but this weapon does appear to set targets on fire when it hits them with the bell too. I can't see any mention of it in the weapon's description or mod page though. Finally, for melee weapons you have the Midas Spear. For a spear, this hits surprisingly fast, following the same pattern as the Damocles sword, more swings rather than big swings. The Midas Spear only has the single downside of a slight movement speed penalty too, and it comes with a very unique upside of afflicting targets struck by it with a Midas Touch debuff that can only be applied to a human-sized target. If the target is killed while this debuff is active, they turn into a small pile of gold, causing all gear to be lost alongside removing the corpse from your map entirely. Ridiculously powerful against a tribal raid, as their bodies are worth far more to you as gold, but less favourable when it's causing those spacer pirates to disappear, alongside their perfectly viable utility items and charge weaponry. One to use with caution, but not dangerous to keep equipped constantly, like the hammer. That leaves us with two ranged weapons, the Bull Slinger and the Tor Railgun. The bow is unique in that it inflicts cold damage, without applying a hypothermia buildup. So any wounds inflicted by this are going to be frostbite, extremely painful without a bleed out risk. The main upside for going Frost Spec is that armour does absolutely dick against it. It's why crypto weapons from the Vikings faction used to be so strong against endgame raids. Biological enemies simply can't defend against that damage type. Even with the bow's large size, heavy draw, extreme range and significant damage, it still has a fairly competitive shot cycle time too, with 1.8 aiming and 1.65 cooldown. If you can get this weapon on someone with a few move speed enhancements, it makes for an ideal low-ish risk weapon to try and capture any runners, extremely likely to drop them from pain rather than landing an outright killing blow. So all you're rolling against then is the death on down chance. All that's left is the Tor Railgun, which is a hell of a 1-2 punch weapon. As well as dealing damage in an AoE splash, shredding multiple limbs at once, it also disperses a terrifying cloud that will cause any targets in the area to flee instead of standing and fighting, allowing just one colonist using this weapon to, quite reliably at times, deny a fortified firing position to the enemy. Whilst its damage isn't necessarily massive, its accuracy might be a little bit stunted and the range is somewhat lackluster, you can't argue with the results of fear on demand that makes enemy raiders do stupid things, like charging towards your firing line, flailing their arms around, or abandoning their lovely secure stone wall in favour of standing in the open for a bit to catch their breath. Technically though, that isn't the final weapon. The last one is just locked behind a setting in the mod options, so we'll hop over there quickly. Chunks can be weaponized if you would like, but they aren't by default because it gets a little bit excessive if you aren't going to make use of it. Chunks can be thrown over a short range and explode in a 3x3 radius, causing massive damage, provided they actually hit the target anyway. These are a single-use projectile, so once you've lobbed it, that's it. Now you're standing around unarmed. They're fun and stupid to use, sure, but you're unlikely to use these outside of purposefully being a dick to someone or trying to make a point. You can also see in the mod options that you have settings for lactation, if it's active on males or females and how much it produces. There are tweaks for the See Red ability, the Tor Rail's Fear effect, and the Midas Spear's gold creation. There's also a checkbox for the vanilla expanded heavy weapon integration here too, so if you prefer for the Herculean trait not to count as viable for equipping them, you can do that for whatever reason. So all of that is what you get from the Minotaur Xenotype mod itself. What about the expansion? You're going to be getting a bunch more backstories added into the pool of potentials, which is handy because you're also going to have 2 more Minotaur factions that will make very good use of them, as well as 3 starting scenarios, some new hairstyles, new cultures, and even a few new bits of gear. So for some, the Xenotype itself was more than enough. This can be seen as bloat, it's entirely optional. For others, this is fantastic as it further integrates the Xenotype into the game and supports their theme further. A few bits here that we can really quickly go over are the new cultures that will be pulling names from set pools, similarly to how Astropolitan, Criminal or Rustican have names and styles that they like to employ. Now you're going to have Bovine and Hellenic options too. The new hairstyles are all listed under Rural, with the 2 new Minotaur factions making use of a different assortment of them. You'll also see that you've got some new ideology icons if you want to go all out for your Minotaur playthrough. The 2 new factions are the Hellenic Minotaur Tribe and the Minotaur Outlanders. The tribe are more relaxed, starting with a neutral opinion of your colony typically, and they're going to use classical weapons and armour with a heavy preference to employ Herculean weapons, on their higher tiered soldiers at least, meaning they can be a fantastic source of wealth and really good gear at high levels, if you're brave enough to challenge them of course. They'll be able to offer you bulk, war and slave traders, and they're especially useful in the early game to assist with things like opening the Ancient Danger or taking down any wandering Thrumbo on your map. The Outlanders however are far more aggressive, employing higher tech gear on top of the already powerful Herculean weapons. They're worth sucking up to in an attempt to make allies though, as they offer bulk, combat, exotic and slave traders, on top of being an incredibly potent emergency call for combat. Although you're always going to want to be a little bit careful around letting the AI use See Red, because if you're fighting alongside a Minotaur faction, their alliances are a little bit more of a suggestion than a rule. These new factions are going to make good use of that new gear too, and you're going to have 2 new weapons, the Pelakis and the Sling. They're both ranged options that don't require the Herculean gene to equip. The Pelakis is a throwing axe that can also be used in melee, with it working similar to a very stunted peeler, in that it does far greater damage when thrown rather than bonked against an enemy's head. This is unlocked with the smithing research and it costs just 45 metal to make, with that metal having absolutely no impact on the range stats of the weapon, only its melee. The biggest drawback of the weapon obviously is the teeny tiny range, at just 8 tiles, with it also taking an incredibly long time to aim. Fortunately, this weapon doesn't have any kind of accuracy values, so if you do manage to get the lengthy wind up off and launch the thing, it always lands on target. With a stopping power that's so high, it makes even a muffalo stop and reconsider what it's doing. Then you have the sling, another weapon that can be made from multiple different materials, with none of those materials having an impact on the weapon's stats. So a cloth sling will perform just as well as a thrumbo fur one. The sling will always be available to craft too, you just need to have access to a smithy, so you can forge it. Because the sling is only throwing tiny rocks, it's going to be doing blunt damage, which on ranged weapons can have its uses. Unfortunately, this takes an age to reload and get back up to speed so it can fire again, with it not offering guaranteed hits like the Pelakis did. Just keep in mind that enemies using these will be bypassing any shield belts that you have equipped, and the weapon itself does enough damage to take out an eye or remove a finger or toe on a good shot, so they can pose a rather annoying risk rather than a lethal one even in the late game. As well as weapons, you're also going to get some new clothing options. You'll find the cowbell and chiton in the tailoring bench, with the chiton unlocked at complex clothing and the cowbell always being available. There'll be 2 new plate helmets after researching plate armour, the Hellenic and Royal variant, and the new armour you may see, but be unable to craft, is the Panoply, an extremely strong set of armour that provides insane amounts of blunt defence and is ideal for melee combat. We're going to start with the cowbell though, because this rundown doesn't have enough.
Guess what? I got a fever. And the only prescription is more cowbell.
Needing just 25 leather or fabric and 10 steel, this provides an additional 10% gathering yield from animals and boosts pain shock threshold by 10% too, at the cost of lowering hunting stealth by 20%. If you're trying to hunt animals that have a revenge chance, you may want to take this off as it's clanging like a dinner bell. Because of the layer this bit of clothing occupies, it's very easy to wear on almost everybody for that small but beneficial bonus to pain shock threshold. It isn't so much that people will now fight to the death, but it also stops people falling down from trivial wounds accumulating over time. The chiton is an alternative to tribal wear in its layering, if not necessarily in its cost and stats. The chiton takes 20 additional materials and needs a little bit more work, with it providing better armour values and more heat insulation at the cost of some cold protection. The biggest issue with using this clothing as your skin layer is that whilst you're making pants and a shirt in one go, you've then got nothing covering the neck, shoulders and arms, so those slots will only be protected by the middle and outer layer now. The more stages of protection an attack needs to penetrate before it can hit the squishy bits, the higher the chance that a blow can be lessened, or ideally completely negated. Of course, that's going to be leaning into more of a min-max approach to gameplay, with lower difficulties allowing you to dress cosmetically without worrying about the nitty-gritty things. Then you have the Hellenic helmets, with the standard taking 65 metal and the Royal needing an additional 25 metal and 15 cloth. Realistically, even if you're not min-maxing, it's still better to use the Royal helm. It has more sharp, blunt and heat armour, as well as providing a little bit of pain shock threshold too. The main upside to these helmets over using a simple one that you unlock at basic smithing is the coverage. These provide armour to everything on the head, eyes, nose and jaw included, so you're much less likely to get horrific eye scars from manhunting animals that cripple colonists for months or even years until you can find them a bionic or a healer serum. These are easily going to carry you right up until marine quality gear in terms of their defensive values too, especially if you go all out with a material and use some bioferrite or plasteel. Consider spending any of your creative inspirations to make these, as the quality multiplier goes a long way as well. That just leaves us with the Panoply, which requires the Herculean trait to equip, so you know it's going to be very heavy armour. This gear has no quality modifier, and it's a set piece of equipment like a gun link or a fire foam pack. Weighing in at 35 kilograms, anyone wearing this is going to be absolute arse gravy for caravanning. It covers the skin, middle and outer layer by itself, providing protection to the torso, neck, shoulders, arms and legs, so your fingers and toes are still going to be a bit vulnerable. Surprisingly, despite its weight, it has very little impact on movement speed, only slowing it by 0.05. It grants 35% sharp armor, 135% blunt armor, and 60% heat armor, so it almost needs to be paired with a shield belt to be effective for a melee combatant, as bullets are still going to pass through this plate with relative ease. It's instead beneficial to wear when taking down things like mechanoids, barring scythers of course, in melee combat, as a mechanoid's blunt headbutts or gun bashes are typically going to bounce fairly harmlessly off this armor. The main thing to be careful about is this armor offers very little heat insulation, making a hot climate or a heat wave very dangerous to the wearer. Standing under a scorching sun for too long wearing this is essentially going to cook the user. As to how you'll need to acquire this, the main source is going to be developing sticky fingers or a silver tongue. You'll want to recruit a raider that was wearing it, or relieve them of it if their stats don't particularly interest you. Whilst this can be exceptionally good armor, it's quite niche in its use compared to a standard late game set, but thanks to its vulnerability to sharp damage, you still have an option when dealing with large forces of Minotaurs that are storming your colony wearing this. Hit and run tactics are an absolute must. And finally we have the 3 new starting scenarios for the Minotaurs. These are pretty thematic as well, rather than some of the hastily thrown together ones you sometimes find on the workshop. Minotaur Nomads is probably the most standard of the 3, with the difficulty being that you're only going to have 2 starting colonists. Obviously nowhere near as difficult as a Naked Brutality start, but it's harder than going with a straightforward Crash Landed. The main risk is going to be getting some food down very quickly, and starting to try and fill any gaps in your colonist skills where possible, as Minotaurs lean much harder towards fighting than building. The Minotaur tribe slots in nicely after a tribal start but before a Crash Landed. You won't be making electrical benches or using powered lights right away, but you're also not banging sticks and rocks together for a year whilst waiting to get the fundamentals established. This also starts you in the rubble of a destroyed settlement, complete with half-built rooms, furniture and corpses, so free meals if you decide to go cannibal. The 4 starting colonists will very quickly get through food thanks to the metabolic efficiency of the race and the larger than normal nutrition bar. So whilst the resources you're given may seem generous, it's incredibly easy to burn through them before the first harvesters come in. You're going to want to get some hunting or ranching started pretty quickly. Fortunately, because you have things like complex furniture and stone cutting, getting down early bedrooms and comfortable essentials is a breeze, so swings and roundabouts on the challenge of this start, which is generally a pretty forgiving scenario. The Poverty Taurus is really unique. You're going to have a sheltered noble and their personal guard land on a planet. The Minotaur is always going to start with a random Herculean weapon, which could be something amazing like a Midas spear, or it could be something a little trickier to use like an oxen hammer. The harder part of this start is going to be getting the ball rolling meaningfully, in a similar way that the rich explorer can suffer under the weight of their own wealth. If you don't get any decent early game prisoners or potential recruits, you can risk being overwhelmed by overstaying your welcome as a lone defender in a more opulent base. And there you have it, the first Xenotype I have covered from Rue's selection. Simply awesome mods. Enough flavour and unique gear added to the game to flesh out the Minotaur itself without completely bloating the world and causing weird issues with other Xenotypes using items that don't match their appearance. It's helped greatly by the limitation put in place of the Herculean gene. And whilst these guys definitely aren't the most horrifying threat to face as some other modded content can provide, they do sit around a similar level to Neanderthals from Biotech, in that if you manage their approach to combat, you'll be fine, but if they get the upper hand and outmaneuver you, you can kiss your ass goodbye. Thanks for waiting for me on this video as well. I know it's taken a little bit longer than normal to get out. I had a bit of time off just to rest and relax as it were. I'm now also officially starting work on the Combat Extended rundown. You'll get a few Rimworld mod essentials in between, but yeah, this is going to be a big project, so I'll keep you updated. If you want to see those updates or the current suggestion list for upcoming mod rundown videos, it's available on my Patreon. All the posts there are totally free to read and the suggestion list is pinned at the top of the page. I update it about once a week or so with any new recommendations you guys have left in the comments. If you want to go further and support me in producing content like this, you can do so from just £1 a month. It'll get your name in the credits of these videos and it helps me not to die. Thanks for watching, folks. If you have any mods you'd like to see a full breakdown for, or suggestions of mods you'd like to see covered, feel free to leave them in the comments. I might get around to them. I'll be back again soon with another Rimworld mod rundown. Wherever you are in the world, enjoy the rest of your morning, afternoon or evening. Take care.